Juliette Moreau was 6 months pregnant when her billionaire husband, Adrian Kane, made her sign a postnuptial agreement while his mistress watched from across the room. What he didn't know was that Juliette was recording everything, and the secret she uncovered next would not only destroy his empire, but expose a chilling conspiracy hidden behind their perfect marriage. Adrian Kane was the kind of man who seemed untouchable. At just 44, he was one of the richest tech moguls in the world, a billionaire several times over thanks to his empire of AI and biotech companies. He moved through the world like a ghost, always in motion, rarely seen, yet always at the center of attention. People admired him, feared him, speculated about his private life, but few truly knew him. That was exactly how he liked it. He rarely gave interviews, stayed out of political debates, and didn't attend the usual celebrity parties. The only glimpse the world had into his personal life came when he stepped out with Juliette Moreau. Juliette was the opposite of Adrian in many ways. She had grown up in a modest suburb outside Paris, the daughter of a piano teacher and a postal worker. Her beauty was undeniable. Classic French elegance with piercing blue eyes and a presence that drew attention without effort. She had modeled briefly in her early 20s, gaining some exposure in European fashion magazines, but she quickly became disillusioned with the industry's demands. By 25, she had stopped modeling and began studying interior design. In London, that's where she met Adrian. Their first meeting wasn't anything dramatic. A mutual friend had invited Juliette to a private fundraiser at a mansion in Notting Hill. Adrian was there as a keynote speaker, talking about the future of genetic engineering in medicine. Juliette barely understood the science, but she found herself watching him. He wasn't conventionally charming, but he had a kind of power in his voice, a cold confidence that was almost hypnotic. After his speech, he introduced himself. There was something strange about the way he looked at her, like he already knew who she was. Later, she would wonder if that first meeting had really been by chance at all. The relationship moved quickly. Within weeks, Adrian flew her to Geneva for a weekend to see a painting, though they never made it to the museum. He showered her with gifts, vintage books, rare teas, handwritten letters in perfect calligraphy. Juliette was overwhelmed but also captivated. He didn't behave like other rich men she had met in the past. He didn't brag or flaunt. If anything, he was reserved, almost secretive. Yet he always seemed to be 5 steps ahead, orchestrating everything behind the scenes. By the time Juliette moved into his Manhattan penthouse, the media had begun to notice. Paparazzi photos of the two walking arm in arm, dining in private clubs, and boarding his jet sparked headlines around the world. Commentators speculated about whether she was just another beautiful accessory or something more serious. 6 months later, Adrian proposed at a secluded beach in Seychelles with no cameras, no audience, just the two of them, and the sound of the ocean. Juliette said yes. She didn't hesitate. Their wedding was held on a private island off the coast of Greece, and it was the kind of event that defied imagination. Guests were flown in on chartered jets. Every detail, from the gold-threaded linens to the imported orchids flown in from Bhutan, had been overseen by Adrian's private team. Juliette wore a couture gown custom-designed for her, and Adrian stood beside her in a hand-tailored suit, unreadable as ever. The media wasn't invited, but somehow exclusive photos still found their way online, sparking a frenzy of admiration and envy. To the world, it looked like a fairy tale. Behind closed doors, however, cracks were already forming. Adrian's world was one of control. Every minute of the day was scheduled. Every person in his orbit was monitored. Juliette soon discovered that even her phone calls were being recorded, her internet activity logged. When she asked about it, he explained it away as standard security. He told her that the higher you climbed, the more people tried to hurt you. She believed him, at first. She wasn't allowed to post on social media without approval. When she decorated their apartment, he replaced half her choices with pieces from his own collection. She had no access to his financial accounts, and even her own bank cards were linked to an account managed by his assistants. Still, he was never cruel. He gave her everything: expensive gifts, weekend getaways, handwritten notes, even flowers, delivered to her room every morning. It was the kind of life most people would dream of. But it felt like a museum. Beautiful, curated, and sterile. When Juliette became pregnant just 8 months after the wedding, she thought things would change. For a brief moment, Adrian softened. He smiled more, touched her stomach when they passed each other, and left small baby gifts on her pillow: designer booties, tiny cashmere sweaters, antique toys that looked too precious to be handled. He hired a team of doctors, nutritionists, and security experts to look after her. She was barely allowed to leave the house without an escort, but she convinced herself it was for her safety. She told herself he was being protective, not controlling. Yet, there was always a coldness behind his care. He never talked about baby names. He showed no interest in ultrasounds. When she asked him if he was excited, he nodded and changed the subject. At first, she thought he was just anxious about fatherhood. But something deeper seemed to be troubling him, something he refused to say aloud. During her second trimester, she began to have vivid dreams. In them, she was running down endless hallways with no doors. Sometimes, she was holding a baby. Other times, her arms were empty. She started to feel watched, even when she was alone. Once, she found a second phone hidden in the back of a kitchen drawer. When she confronted Adrian, he simply said it belonged to a staff member and dismissed her concern. The loneliness was creeping in. Her family and friends rarely heard from her anymore. Calls were brief, emails were filtered. Her old friends had stopped checking in, assuming she was too busy living a glamorous life. She missed the days when she could walk to a cafe, have a simple conversation, and feel like a person. Now she was an ornament, a symbol of perfection carefully designed to fit into Adrian's world. And yet she couldn't leave. Not just because she was pregnant, or because she had nowhere to go, but because she didn't fully understand what she was trapped in. It wasn't a marriage. It was something else. Something invisible, vast, and calculated. She began to notice little things: how Adrian's meetings always seemed to involve the same people, how he referred to the baby not as our child, but as the next phase, and how his assistant once slipped up and called Juliette the subject. Still, she said nothing. She smiled for the photographers when they happened to catch her stepping out of a clinic. She replied with polite thanks to congratulatory messages. She curled up in bed every night wondering what she had gotten herself into. What she didn't know was that the most chilling part of her story had yet to begin. Juliette was in her 6th month of pregnancy when Adrian asked her to join him at their mountain estate in Aspen. It wasn't unusual for him to make sudden plans, but something about the request felt different. He didn't offer a reason, didn't suggest how long they would stay, and didn't ask if she felt well enough to travel. A private jet was already arranged. Her assistant had packed for her. All she had to do was board the plane. The estate sat at the top of a snow-covered ridge, surrounded by pines and silence. The house itself was a sprawling structure of steel and glass, cold and modern, reflecting the icy landscape like a mirror. Juliette had always found it beautiful but impersonal, more like a museum than a home. The staff greeted her warmly when she arrived, but Adrian wasn't there. He was flying in later that evening, she was told. She spent the afternoon alone, walking the polished stone floors of the house, listening to the silence press in around her. Something about it all felt staged. The temperature in the house was uncomfortably cool, and the guest rooms had been shut. Only the master suite had been prepared. There was a tray of fresh fruit beside the bed, and a bottle of herbal supplements marked with her name. A nurse she didn't recognize came by to take her vitals, then left without making conversation. When Adrian arrived, he was in work mode, on the phone, pacing the hallways, barely looking at her. That night, he finally sat across from her at the dining table. The meal was elaborate, but neither of them ate much. He said almost nothing during dinner, and the little he did say was clipped, businesslike. Juliette knew that version of him well. It was the version that came out before. Something unpleasant. The next morning, everything unraveled. She was led into the study by one of Adrian's assistants, a slim, unsmiling woman with a tablet in hand. Juliette was confused at first. She expected to discuss the baby, maybe review medical plans, but instead she was shown a thick document laid out on the mahogany desk. It was a postnuptial agreement. The assistant explained, without warmth, that Adrian had decided to adjust the terms of their marriage in light of new developments. In simpler terms, the agreement stripped Juliette of all financial claims to his estate in the event of divorce. There were provisions for the baby, an annual trust and limited health care coverage, but Juliette herself would receive nothing beyond a modest monthly stipend. The house she lived in, the clothes she wore, even the staff she relied on, they would all be revoked if she ever left him. The message was clear: stay and obey, or leave with nothing. Juliette stared at the document, her ears ringing. She asked where Adrian was. The assistant told her he would be joining them shortly. A few minutes later, he walked in. But he wasn't alone. A woman followed behind him, tall, striking, and unmistakably familiar. Juliette had seen her face before, though she couldn't immediately place it. Then it hit her. Sienna Rhodes, an influencer, known mostly for her lavish lifestyle and frequent collaborations with luxury brands. Juliette had seen her in passing on social media, but never imagined she would meet her like this. Sienna said nothing. She simply sat on the edge of a chair and watched. Juliette's heart raced, not just from shock, but from something deeper. Betrayal. Adrian didn't introduce Sienna. He didn't explain why she was there. Instead, he pointed to the document and asked if Juliette had any questions before signing. She did, but none that she said aloud. She asked for a moment alone, which he granted. In the quiet of the study, she reached for her scarf, the one she had begun wearing since the 3rd trimester, to protect her throat from the cold mountain air. Inside the lining, she had stitched a hidden voice recorder, small enough to be missed by the routine security checks. She activated it with a soft press. Everything that followed, Adrian's demands, his threats, the presence of Sienna, and the coercion, would be captured. When he returned, she sat still, her hands folded. He reiterated that signing was in everyone's best interest. She looked at the pen, looked at Sienna's blank expression, then signed her name. It wasn't the real signature, not exactly. She signed in a style similar to her own, but with a deliberate flaw, an inconsistency in the second T of her name that she knew could be detected by a handwriting analyst. a quiet insurance policy. Sienna gave a small, approving nod when it was over. Adrian took the document and left without looking back. The assistant gathered the papers and exited the room. Juliette sat for a long time after they left, breathing slowly, trying to stop her hands from shaking. She didn't cry. There was no room for tears, only planning. She uploaded the recording to her cloud account using a secure app she had installed weeks earlier, just in case something like this ever happened. That night, she didn't sleep. Every movement in the house made her flinch. The wind outside howled, like a warning. She thought about her baby, still growing, still unaware of the strange world it was being born into. She thought about the future Adrian was trying to control, the version of her life that he wanted to trap her in. And then she thought about Sienna. The woman hadn't said a word during the entire ordeal, but her presence had been louder than anything. Juliette knew instinctively that this wasn't a simple affair. Sienna had power, influence, perhaps even knowledge of things Juliette had yet to uncover. She didn't seem like someone who was just passing through Adrian's life. She seemed embedded. The next morning, Juliette left the estate under the pretense of a medical appointment. Adrian didn't object. He had gotten what he wanted, or so he thought. But Juliette was no longer operating within the script he had written. She flew back to New York and began setting things in motion. She contacted an old friend from university, someone who worked in investigative media. She secured a lawyer specializing in digital forensics. And most importantly, she began to unravel the lies she had once mistaken for love. The prenup was signed. The mistress was real. But Juliette was done playing her role. She was no longer a trophy, no longer a possession, no longer a character in Adrian Kane's controlled narrative. She was becoming the author. In the weeks following her return from Aspen, Juliette kept her movements quiet and deliberate. She smiled when the doorman greeted her. She responded politely to Adrian's texts, which had returned to their usual clinical tone. She showed up for scheduled medical appointments, posed for the occasional discreet paparazzi photo outside the clinic, and continued the performance of a dutiful, glowing wife. But underneath the surface, she was unraveling threads, each one a connection to something deeper, something darker. Her first priority was understanding who Sienna Rhodes really was. The influencer's social media profiles were full of curated perfection, vacations in Bali, skincare routines, designer fittings, motivational captions. But Juliette noticed something peculiar. Sienna's timeline overlapped far too neatly with Adrian's travel schedule. Even places he had claimed to visit alone, Sienna had quietly posted from. Different angles, different filters, same days. It was clear now that Sienna had been in the picture far longer than Juliette realized. Digging further, Juliette found that Sienna had recently partnered with a startup called Gen Labs. It wasn't one of the trendy health brands she usually endorsed. There were no public products, no glossy ads, and no user-friendly websites. In fact, the company seemed deliberately low profile. But its connection to Adrian was undeniable. Juliette found his name listed discreetly on corporate documents as the majority stakeholder, hidden through layers of shell companies. Gen Labs, according to scattered research papers and obscure tech forums, was developing advanced genetic selection tools, not just for detecting diseases but for enhancing embryos, choosing traits, eye color, intelligence markers, even personality predispositions. It sounded like science fiction, but the more she read, the more real and disturbing it became. Adrian hadn't just invested in the future of medicine. He was trying to control it. Juliette began piecing together a timeline. A few months before their wedding, Adrian had visited a research facility in Sweden under the guise of a medical conference. Around the same time, Juliette's birth control pills, prescribed by Adrian's recommended doctor, had been mysteriously switched to a different brand. She remembered feeling dizzy and out of sync for several weeks, but had brushed it off as stress. Now, it felt like part of a larger plan. Her pregnancy, which she'd assumed was a natural outcome of love and timing, was starting to feel like something far more intentional. She requested a copy of her fertility clinic records using a legal contact she trusted. What she found left her frozen. The procedure had been done via IVF. She was told at the time that it was a precautionary measure after minor hormonal irregularities, nothing out of the ordinary. But the documents showed no such irregularities. What they did show was that the embryo had been selected from a group of pre-implanted samples. Not only that, the genetic profile used for the embryo did not fully match Adrian's. A full comparison report listed a donor ID, anonymous, untraceable. She wasn't just carrying a child. She was carrying a genetic experiment. The realization shattered something inside her. Her body, her trust, her very idea of motherhood. It had all been used without consent. Everything Adrian had done now made sense. The postnup wasn't about money. It was about control. He had engineered a child, stripped Juliette of legal power, and tried to lock her into silence before the truth surfaced. But he had underestimated her. The next move required care. She knew she couldn't confront Adrian directly. Not yet. Instead, she reached out to a seasoned investigative journalist named Clara Reeves, whose work had exposed unethical medical trials in South America and illegal data harvesting by major corporations. Clara had built her career on secrecy and evidence, and when Juliette contacted her using an encrypted channel, Clara listened. Juliette sent her the full audio recording from Aspen, the moment Adrian demanded the signature, the presence of Sienna, the veiled threats. She also shared the clinic files, the mismatched genetic reports, and the ownership structure of VitaGen Labs. Clara didn't respond for 2 days. When she did, it was with a single message. I believe you. We'll tell the story. Within a month, a short-form documentary went live under Clara's media brand, timed for maximum exposure. It was called Control: Inside the Kane Empire. The 27-minute video began with footage of Juliette walking into the Aspen estate. Silent, pregnant, flanked by snow and shadows. Then came the audio. Adrian's voice, measured and cold, explaining how things needed to be done for the family's future. Sienna's quiet presence in the room. The final sound of a pen scratching across paper. From there, the documentary unfolded rapidly. Experts explained the legality, or lack thereof, of coercing a pregnant woman into signing away her rights. Geneticists broke down the implications of designer embryos and what it meant that the child's DNA had been edited without consent. Ethics professors called it one of the most disturbing misuses of technology they'd seen. Social media erupted. Within hours, Adrian's name was trending worldwide. Corporate sponsors pulled out of deals. Activist groups staged protests outside his company headquarters. Hashtags like Free Juliette and Designer Baby Scandal flooded every platform. His board convened an emergency meeting and announced that Adrian Kane would be stepping down to address personal matters. Sienna deleted all her online profiles and disappeared. Juliette, meanwhile, stayed out of sight. Through Clara's team, she issued a carefully written statement. She thanked the public for their support, but declined interviews. She said her focus was on her unborn child and their safety. What she didn't say, what she was still holding back, was the final piece of her plan. She had more than just a story. She had leverage. Before the documentary aired, Juliette had used a legal loophole to quietly transfer her shares in one of Adrian's companies, specifically the parent entity of VitaGen Labs, to a trust created in the name of her child. It had taken careful work, obscure filings, and the assistance of a whistleblower within Adrian's financial team. But it was done. The child Adrian had designed to be his legacy was now, ironically, the owner of the very tool he had used for control. The media didn't know it yet, neither did Adrian. But soon, they would. Juliette watched it all unfold from a small rented house in coastal Maine, her belly growing larger by the day. She sat by the fire in the evenings, hands resting on her stomach, thinking not about revenge, but about reclaiming a future she had almost lost. Adrian had wanted to build a perfect life, sculpted by money and technology. What he had built instead was the foundation of his own collapse, and Juliette, once the ornament, the silent wife, had become the architect of his undoing. The morning the video was released, Adrian Kane woke up to silence, as he always did. His Manhattan penthouse, perched above the city like a glass fortress, was soundproofed to perfection. He drank his usual black coffee, checked his encrypted messages, and stepped into his home office with the detached focus of a man who believed he controlled everything around him. What he didn't know was that, outside the sleek walls of his empire, the world was already turning against him. It started with a whisper, a few posts on niche forums, a link shared in private group chats. Then, within hours, the documentary had exploded across every major platform. Millions of views, hundreds of thousands of shares. The title alone was enough to ignite outrage. Control. Inside the Kane Empire. But it was the content that stunned viewers. There was no need for dramatic music or special effects. The facts alone were damning. People heard his voice, flat and commanding, as he ordered his visibly pregnant wife to sign away her rights. They heard the stillness in the room, the heavy silence of coercion, the unmistakable click of a pen. Experts weighed in, legal analysts, bioethicists, fertility doctors. One clip featured a renowned reproductive law attorney who stated plainly, "What we're hearing is not just immoral, it could be criminal." Then came the twist that pushed the story from scandal to something far more insidious, the genetic manipulation. For the first time, the public learned that Juliette Kane's pregnancy had not been a natural conception. She had undergone IVF, without fully informed consent. Worse, the embryo implanted in her had been selected, not for medical reasons but for enhancement. Intelligence, physical traits, psychological tendencies. Even more disturbing was the revelation that Adrian himself might not be the biological father. A donor ID, tied to a confidential database, was shown briefly on screen. Viewers were told the sperm had come from an unknown source chosen to optimize the genetic profile. The idea that a billionaire had bypassed nature, choice, and ethics to create a child built to his specifications sent shockwaves through the public. Social media exploded in rage and disbelief. Hashtags surged. Our designer baby scandal trended worldwide. Influencers who had once admired Adrian for his tech vision now called him a sociopath. Former employees came forward, anonymously at first, describing the culture of secrecy and fear inside his companies. Even some of his corporate allies began issuing carefully worded statements, distancing themselves from him while claiming shock at the revelations. Adrian was blindsided. He had anticipated resistance when the postnuptial was signed. Perhaps even legal challenges. But he hadn't expected Juliette to expose him. He had counted on her silence, on her fear, on the carefully curated isolation he had spent years crafting around her. The idea that she had recorded him, that she had shared documents with the press, that she had turned public opinion against him, it was inconceivable. He called his legal team. Half of them didn't answer. The ones who did sounded different. Cold, cautious, non-committal. Lawsuits were being prepared. Government regulators were now involved. A federal inquiry had been launched into Vita Labs, and his name was listed on the first round of subpoenas. He fired off messages to his PR strategists, demanding a response plan. But the usual tactics weren't working. The scandal wasn't just personal, it was systemic. It hit a nerve, triggering fears about reproductive rights, technological overreach, and the erasure of consent. Parents spoke out. Advocacy groups released statements. Former patients of fertility clinics began asking questions. Adrian wasn't just a man with a mistress. He was now seen as the architect of a dystopian future. Meanwhile, Juliette remained out of sight. She had gone completely dark. No statements beyond the original one, no public appearances, no social media. The only sign of her came from a blurry photo posted anonymously, a woman with a rounded belly walking along a quiet beach somewhere in the Northeast. The image went viral, fueling speculation about where she was and what she might do next. But what no one knew was that she had already done it. Behind the scenes, Juliette had taken the most critical step in dismantling Adrian's power. Using the evidence she had collected, and with the help of legal experts, she had transferred ownership of several key patents and rights held by Vita Labs into a trust. That trust, named after her unborn child, now held a controlling interest in the company. It was a bold move, some said reckless, but it was legal, ironclad even, and it was irreversible. By the time Adrian discovered the maneuver, it was too late. He tried to challenge it. He claimed fraud, emotional instability, undue influence. But the courts weren't sympathetic. The video alone had painted a picture of manipulation and abuse. Juliette had not acted rashly. She had acted to protect herself and her child from a man who saw them as tools in his experiment. What shocked Adrian most wasn't the betrayal, it was the intelligence of it all. The precision, the strategy. He had spent years believing he was the only one capable of forward thinking, but Juliette had outmaneuvered him. Silently, patiently, and with the kind of resolve that no algorithm could predict. As headlines raged, and cameras camped outside his offices, Adrian's world shrank. Board members called emergency meetings, investors pulled out, government contracts were suspended. One of his top AI companies lost $1 billion deal overnight. And still, the public kept watching, waiting for more. What else had Adrian done? Behind closed doors? How many others had been affected by his reach? Were there more children, more experiments, more secrets buried in the data files of his empire? Every move he made now was scrutinized. Every silence, every denial, every vague press release only deepened the suspicion. And Juliette? She watched. It all from a distance. She spent her days in quiet, doing the small things that had once felt ordinary, cooking, reading, folding baby clothes. Her phone stayed off. Her lawyer handled the media requests. Her focus was entirely on the child growing inside her. It hadn't been easy. The weight of public attention, the anxiety, the lingering sense of violation, all of it pressed down on her like an invisible storm. But she held firm. Because for the first time in a long time, she was no longer living in someone else's shadow. She was no longer part of a story written by someone else. And as Adrian's empire crumbled around him, as the world picked apart every lie and every secret he had tried to hide, Juliette was quietly preparing for something far more powerful than revenge. She was preparing to bring a new life into the world, one that, against all odds, would be free, not engineered. Not controlled, just human. 3 weeks before her due date, Juliette released a final, carefully written statement through her legal team. The document was brief, just over a page, and devoid of any emotional flourish. It was not designed to win sympathy or incite further public outrage. It served one purpose only, to deliver the final blow. In it, she revealed that the postnuptial agreement Adrian Kane had forced her to sign was not legally binding. The document he had paraded as his safety net, his power play, his masterstroke, it was a forgery. Her signature, she explained, had been analyzed by 2 independent forensic experts. The results showed clear signs of digital manipulation. The ink did not match. The pressure patterns were inconsistent, and the time-stamped metadata from the scanned copy Adrian's lawyers submitted to court did not align with the original date of signing. It was not her hand that had signed it. It was his hand that had faked it. The internet responded with fury, fascination, and disbelief. Just when the public thought they had seen the full picture, Juliette unveiled a deeper layer of deception. This wasn't just a story of betrayal. It was a story of fraud, coercion, and calculated abuse of power on a scale few could comprehend. Media outlets scrambled to confirm the new details. Legal commentators debated what penalties Adrian might face. Law enforcement began their own investigation into the forged documents. But Juliette wasn't done. In the final paragraph of her statement, she confirmed what had been speculated about for weeks. She had transferred controlling interest in Vitagen Labs to a trust created in the name of her unborn child. The move had been finalized before the scandal erupted. The trust owned not only the intellectual property, but the operating rights of several key patents related to embryonic gene editing, assets that Adrian had built his empire upon. In a single act, Juliette had taken the company he once used to manipulate her and placed it beyond his reach. The news was seismic. Industry insiders scrambled to understand what it meant for the future of biotech. Lawmakers began drafting legislation to close the legal loopholes Adrian had exploited. Public health organizations demanded accountability from the clinics that had participated, knowingly or otherwise, in his plans. And Adrian? His silence was deafening. In the days following the statement, he made no public appearances. His social media accounts went dark. The buildings bearing his name removed their signage overnight. Reporters camped outside his remaining properties. Protesters gathered at the gates of his estate in upstate New York. But the man who had once commanded attention in every room had vanished into the very shadows he once hid others in. Inside, Adrian was unraveling. The walls were closing in. Lawsuits multiplied. Class action filings from other women who had undergone procedures at his affiliated clinics emerged, each claiming some form of misrepresentation or unauthorized genetic intervention. International watchdog groups demanded access to the company's records. Interpol even launched a parallel inquiry after rumors surfaced of overseas testing programs linked to Adrian's early ventures. He hired a new legal team, then another. None could stop the bleeding. What haunted Adrian most wasn't the scandal itself, but the knowledge that Juliette had anticipated every move. She hadn't just exposed him. She had studied him, mapped out the weaknesses in his empire, and dismantled it from within. And the entire time, she had played the role he assigned her, quiet, obedient, harmless. He realized now that he had mistaken her grace for fragility, her silence for ignorance. He had underestimated her intelligence, her resolve, and most fatally, her capacity for vengeance. But it wasn't even vengeance, really. Juliette hadn't moved against him out of hatred. She had moved out of necessity, survival, protection, and love for the child she now held in her arms. The birth took place in a private clinic under a false name. There were no photographers, no news leaks, no gilded hospital suites. Just Juliette, a midwife, and a team she trusted. The baby came quietly into the world, healthy and strong, with dark eyes that blinked slowly at the light. A boy. When she held him for the first time, she felt everything and nothing all at once. Relief, joy, sadness, fear. But most of all, clarity. He was not a project. He was not a blueprint. He was not the culmination of a billionaire's dream or a scientist's ambition. He was her son, entirely his own person, entirely free. She named him Lucien, after her grandfather, a quiet man who used to tell her that strength wasn't about volume. It was about endurance. Juliette didn't go public with photos or interviews. She declined $1 million book deal. She ignored the offers for exclusive features. Her silence at this point spoke louder than any appearance could. She moved again, this time to a coastal town in northern Europe, where no one knew her name, and the sea washed clean the noise of the past. Every so often, her lawyer would update her on the progress of the investigations. Adrian had been formally indicted for forgery and fraud. Vitagen Labs, now under independent oversight, had shifted its focus to ethical research, with Lucien's trust controlling all executive decisions through a neutral advisory board. Juliette had made it clear, the company's future would serve humanity, not manipulate it. Adrian Kane was no longer a billionaire. His remaining assets had been frozen, his companies dissolved or sold. His name, once associated with innovation, was now shorthand for betrayal and abuse. He remained under house arrest, awaiting trial, isolated in a glass palace that had become his prison. The world eventually moved on to new scandals, new headlines, but the story of Juliette and Adrian lingered. It was taught in law schools, debated in ethics seminars, used as a cautionary tale in medical conferences. A reminder that no matter how powerful someone seemed, no matter how many layers of protection they wrapped around themselves, the truth could still break through. Back in her quiet house, Juliette would often watch Lucien sleep. He had a way of curling his tiny fingers into fists, like he was holding on to something unseen. She didn't know what his future would look like. She didn't pretend it would be easy. The shadow of his origins would follow them for a long time. But she knew one thing with absolute certainty. She had protected him, not with wealth, not with fame, but with truth.